We here at WKAR exist to serve Mid-Michigan with trusted journalism and local programming. Federal funding has been eliminated, which means community support is critical to sustaining this service and helping WKAR meet evolving community needs. Your ongoing support ensures public media remains freely available and locally focused. Become a sustaining member or upgrade your current gift today. Sustain what matters. Build what's next.
Another edition of Off the Record, this time with guest progressive Democrat Dylan Wegela from Garden City. Our lead story, the governor has another face-to-face with President Trump. On the OTR panel, we've got lots of good people, so sit in with us as we get the inside out. Off the Record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Thank you very much. Welcome back to Off the Record. Well, a semi-busy news week in our town. The governor in the Oval Office again with Mr. Trump. What do you make of this story, Lily?
Well, Tim, I mean, none of us knew that she was going to be there. It was certainly a surprise to hear that she was, but you know, she came away with a big win, and that was that she had secured this long-awaited and long begged for by many folks in the state, federal assistance for Northwest Michigan to help finish recovering or finish paying for the recovery of the ice storm that hit Northwest Michigan last spring.
They're still digging out, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really, really rough time on the infrastructure up there. You know, you had trees that just froze and then broke and then fell on the ground, and power lines. It was a really, really rough situation for the infrastructure, and there's a lot of financial recovery still going on.
Yeah, and of course, President Trump did approve about $50 million in federal funding.
But not
it was,
the whole enchilada.
No, this was for governments and nonprofits. And so the parts that were excluded for homeowners, the damages that they took, and also for public utilities, or excuse me, private utilities, they have co-ops up there primarily, those were excluded. And so some of these co-ops, Presque Isle, Great Lakes Energy, they took hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, and it's sort of making their financial solvency a little bit shaky.
Well, and I also want to say, too, I think that we should start maybe giving up this concept of that it's a surprise that she's meeting with President Trump, or that it's out of the blue. This is her third time since President Trump has returned to office this term that she has met with the president. And for the last several times that she's met with him, you know, she has come away with wins. There's Selfridge. Now we have this FEMA funding. You know, we also look at other places. You've seen New York Mayor Zoran Mamdani meeting with President Trump in order to help advance his agenda over in New York and access things for his constituency there. I mean, it's very clear that this is you have to play the game if you want to win sort of mindset. And I think that Whitmer's really showing here that, especially if I may think back to the blue folder kind of incident, where maybe the non-announcement of her visit, maybe that was a little calculated, but at the end, she still did secure a huge win for Michigan. And I think if it like this pretext of like, well, we should be maybe surprised or whatnot, we should honestly probably expect for this to continue.
She must be fighting the urge to go, told you so.
Well, I have to imagine that she is. And, you know, looking at the press releases from Republicans in Michigan in my inbox on that day, you know, not a single one made mention of the governor. It was all, you know, this was a victory for Michigan Republicans who have been working tirelessly to secure this money for our region and our state. And, you know, I'm sure that there has been a lot going on behind the scenes. Obviously, there's a lot of lobbying that goes on for situations like this. But, you know, I'm sure that had to feel vindicating for her, because this is something that she's been talking about since Trump came back into office, where she was saying to members of her own party, hey, you know, let me do my thing. I'm not coming out as the leader of the opposition this time around. I'm going to be the person who, you know, keeps my head down a little bit. I'm going to work with him. I'm going to be, you know, maybe not stepping out and sticking my neck out every time that there's an issue. I really wish I could, but that's going to pay off down the line in times like this, and like Jordan said, with situations like Selfridge.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think of, you know, I think a lot of speeches, discussion has been had about sort of the ideology, the outlook and doctrines of the MAGA movement. The bottom line is, this is a president who builds himself on personal relationships. You know, he's a New York real estate developer who's always excelled in sort of that one-on-one deal making, and he likes people who seem like winners, who are effective political leaders, and you know, sort of have good control over their own constituencies. And Gretchen Whitmer, this is an area where she's excelled. Sort of retail politics, the one-on-one meeting and sort of charming people that she's trying to win over.
This is what she does.
It is. And I think the one thing that I'm sure she's aware of right now is, this is still one of those things, this and also the Selfridge project, because we do have to watch out for the follow through, right? We see her take these meetings, we see her talk to these folks, and we see her talk to the president, but there is an element of cautious optimism here, right? And I'm sure that that's something that she's very, very cognizant of, because what we got from the president, reportedly, because we're getting this from her office, we haven't heard much from the White House on this. I think we got a confirmation earlier in the week, but we just heard, them agreeing to send funding. We haven't heard a dollar amount. We haven't heard, what this is going to look like. And I think similar to Selfridge, where we're getting kind of vague information, we need to know what down the line this is going to manifest
and
as.
An important aspect of this meeting, too, was about the Brandon Interroad project in Illinois, this series of barriers hoping to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, invasive carp. And, after this meeting, Trump posted on Truth Social saying, I'm going to work with Gretchen Whitmer to get this done. But, the federal government is a huge Byzantine bureaucracy. And essentially, this is a promise from the president that we are just going to leap over all of these administrative barriers that have slowed this project down time and time again and get this done for you.
Well,
because there's never been a person who leaps over bureaucratic barriers. It is Donald Trump.
Well, he leaped over FEMA on this up north thing.
I mean, and that's the thing, though. If we are going to take the president at his word, which could change day to day, frankly, if there is somebody who does leap over bureaucratic barriers, it has been Trump.
The interesting thing here, how does she pick and choose what she's going to diss him on? Okay, she's talked very candidly about tariffs, very upfront. Obviously, she has to. It's the auto industry. But it must be interesting how they do the calculus. Can I go there or can I not go there?
Yes, and she's been notably silent on another issue that's riled up a lot of her base constituency, which is the ICE facility that's being built in Romulus, which I think we're going to hear about. Yeah.
Well, and that was something I heard from folks at State of the State, her own fellow Democrats, saying that, we were really upset to hear that she had not mentioned that at all. And you talk about how does she pick and choose these kinds of issues. It's the issues with both either the most broadest appeal, who is going to say I am against getting storm relief for Michiganders, who is going to say that I want more invasive species in my Great Lakes, or that I don't want some kind of financial bonus to Michigan should we get with the Selfridge thing.
Who is going to say we need an ICE facility down in this guy's district? What's going on?
And that's the thing. And I mean, I did actually speak with Representative Wegela, and he was one of the individuals who did tell me that he was disappointed to not hear that was something not mentioned, because we have seen elsewhere throughout the country, everyday citizens who are legally here, they are being put at risk when they go out and they protest, and we are seeing just an absolute cacophony of things happening surrounding immigration enforcement.
So speaking about disappointment, the education lobby has to be disappointed that this petition drive to raise taxes on the rich ain't going nowhere, if you'll pardon my bad English.
Yeah, I mean, investing in my kids was an attempt to raise taxes on some of the wealthiest Michiganders, individuals making $500,000 a year, couples making more than $1 million, raising their income tax by amending the state constitution in order to bring that money into public schools.
Now, let me just interrupt. Did you think when you heard this is a no-brainer? It'll be on the ballot.
I mean, this is certainly economic populism, but the thing is, a policy can be really popular, and it can have a lot of political support behind it. But running a ballot campaign is more than just about picking a popular policy.
But these guys were not amateurs. They knew what the goal was.
Okay. So I watched a lot of the Board of State canvassers when this thing was in its infancy. And one of the issues that it ran into early on was with its 100-word summary. And this is going to sound a little jargony, but what they had a problem with was a legal argument from the other side, the opposition, that this would constitute an illegal change of the state tax distribution and the state tax code. And my theory, the line that we got from the organizers of the campaign yesterday when they announced it was that they didn't have a path to collecting enough signatures. And maybe that's true. What my theory is that maybe they saw a legal challenge off in the future, a challenge to their signatures that was going to arise out of that type of issue they had earlier in the process. 6 months
to figure that out?
Hey, attorneys are going to be attorneys, Tim. And my theory is that maybe they need to take some time with some tax attorneys, write a new version of this proposal and bring it back next year when they can, know that it's fully legally foolproof, and really be able to bring it before the body that's going to make sure the signatures are legit, which is the Board of State Canvassers, and not have to, have that extra layer of dubiousness around it at all from the business lobby, which is, the primary opposition to it.
Well, I just say you look at what they announced the other day. They had something around like 250,000 signatures out of a needed almost like 446,000 signatures. So they were a little over halfway there. If we're looking at the proposal on its face, it would have affected, or at least based off of tax returns that we were able to, not tax returns, but sort of like tax stats we were able to review, fewer than 60,000 Michiganders who filed in 2021 out of the 4.9 million who filed would have been affected. This would have hit people making $500,000 worth of income, or $1 million for joint filers. I mean, there's an appetite here. Whether or not we'll see it, there was $1 million for joint filers. It was $500,000 for single filers. Yeah. So there's clearly an appetite, is what I'm saying. They said that they're going to come back in 2028. It's a presidential election. There's going to be even more eyes on the ballot. A midterm is a big time to get eyes on the ballot. But if you definitely want to see something pass, presidential ticket is the golden standard there.
Well, the interesting thing about this graduated income tax sort of thing, which is what it is, sort of a theme and variation over the past, that's not gotten anywhere. And people have said, look, if you make more money, shouldn't you pay more taxes?
Right, and it does require some subtlety of messaging, right? Because it's not like the income tax is going to go from this to this. It's still going to be flat, but there's just going to be an uptick at the very end. And so trying to get that nuance across is difficult, especially when you're probably going to have an opposition campaign who's going to say, look, they're just trying to raise taxes in general.
Well, and that's been the argument, from, chambers of commerce and the business groups who opposed it this year. This constitutes a graduated income tax hike, and the message we got from Invest in My Kids was this is a surcharge, and whether or not that was successful, I suppose, remains to be seen. But if they can message that right, I don't think that life is going to be less expensive or drastically more affordable for most Michiganders in a year and a half. And I don't think it's a tough message to sell. Give kids money for school instead of public.
We get to the amount of money too. It would amount to something like less than 10% of what we currently spend on the. It's like something like a $20 billion budget for education. It would raise something like $1.7, I believe, billion in estimation. So it's not a huge, and it sounds crazy to say out loud. That's not a huge chunk of money we're talking about, but in perspective, it really isn't.
And it would be a constitutionally protected revenue stream if it remains the way they had it written in this iteration, and we're talking so much right now about the school aid fund and, holding the school aid fund harmless from, skimming off the top of it. This would be one way to contribute to that by creating a stream of revenue that, you can't pull away from.
All right, very quickly, the Speaker announced this week that he wants to take all of the green mandates that are now filtered into the Public Service Commission, which sets utility rates, take those off the table, get rid of them, and just do affordability and reliability. Is this DOA in the Senate and DOA at the governor's desk?
I mean, I suppose, I hate to be like it remains to be seen, but here's what my take is on it. He's trying to repeal something that the active sitting Democratic Senate played a hand in passing. I don't really know or see any situation in which they bite on that, or Whitmer bites on that, considering she signed off on it, unless there's something else that's attached to it that Hall he hasn't showed his hand yet on, that could make the Senate change their mind.
There's also an implied connection here, which is that the rollout of renewable energy is the thing that's driving up rates for utility customers. And that hasn't been proven. We haven't seen a lot of evidence in that regard. And right now, the Trump administration is keeping open a coal plant at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars to ratepayers. And we haven't heard much about that from the legislature.
All right, let's call in our guest today to talk about ICE and other stuff. Representative, welcome back to Off the Record. I mispronounced your name in the open. And my first mistake this year. My apologies, sir. Pronounce your last name.
Yeah, it's Wegela.
Close. Okay, I was close, all right? ICE coming to your district. What's going on?
Yeah, so in my district, we have a warehouse that's being converted by the Department of Homeland Security into an ICE detention center. I think one of the things to center is where the location is, which is essentially next to several thriving neighborhoods. The area in the city is not zoned for this, obviously. There was no communication with local officials or state officials or even congressional officials on this come to town. So it's something that we're pretty much all unanimously opposing in the area, and hopefully we're going to be able to block it, but I think it's going to be an uphill battle.
Through the courts or what?
I think it'll be interesting. Obviously, we have federalism in the United States, and there's the supremacy clause. But there's a little bit of hope. I think with public pushback, maybe we can get this administration to change their mind. But also, it's not zoned for that. So, sometimes, maybe we can get local zoning to prevail there.
Who owned the property?
So it was owned by, I can't remember the exact name, but it was up for sale, and it was actually, before it was sold, was about to be sold to, I believe, Toyota, which would have brought good working class jobs to the district, but instead it was sold to ICE, and I don't know if the details have come out about this.
So basically you guys messed up, because if you had gotten to the seller, you might have been able to convince him or her or they not to do this.
I think if there was some public notice of this, that would certainly...
Well, aren't you supposed to know this stuff?
That's an interesting way to phrase this. I think if the federal government was operating in a way that was transparent to the public and to the community, yeah, we could have definitely done more pushback, and we're going to do everything we can to push back against this.
So when you and I spoke during Governor Gretchen Whitmer's final State of the State address, ICE and her lack of mention was something that you and several other House Democrats did identify as something you were disappointed in. What, I suppose, would you like to see the governor do on this message?
Yeah, I think we're at this unique time in American history, right? We have this paramilitary force, ICE, that is now, we need to remind people that they defunded food stamps and they defunded health care so that they could fund ICE. And ICE is funded now at a level that is more than most militaries across the world. And we are seeing this organization violate the rights of American citizens. Since October, ICE has lost 4,400 times in court. So to me, I believe if a governor of this state should be pushing back against that. And the governor should be helping us with putting this public pressure to make sure that ICE does not open a detention center in my district, another one in the state. Obviously, we have the one in Baldwin.
But so beyond public statements, I guess, is there anything tangible that she can do? Because when I spoke with House Minority Leader Ranjiv Puri, he said just because the governor didn't necessarily mention it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily an issue, but that we shouldn't be taking swings, and I'm very paraphrasing here his words, but basically shouldn't be taking swings at every and all possible messaging.
I think
on every idea.
I think we should be taking a swing here. I mean, we saw what was happening in Minnesota. We saw American citizens be killed. We saw rights repeatedly violated. I think if we're going to take a swing at anything, this is one of the issues. I mean, we are seeing in ICE detention last year alone, there was a record number of deaths. I think there's already been at least 10 deaths in ICE detention this year. So to protect the people of Michigan, I believe this is one that anyone and everyone should be coming together on.
At the height of the sort of era of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, people were talking in academia about the idea of an eye of Sauron, and that the idea is you keep your head down, you don't speak up too much, you're not too bold, because you don't want to have the federal government turning its attention to you and then bringing enforcement. The president's enmity towards Tim Walz, I think, certainly played a role in the enforcement in Minnesota. Do you think that, if she becomes too outspoken, that could come back to bite us?
I mean, certainly this administration could retaliate for anything. But I think the choice we are facing is when fascists are at the door, do we stand up to them, or do we find ways to stay quiet to protect our own self-interests, or somehow believe that's going to help protect the interests of the state?
Do you believe President Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do.
So again, though, I guess I go back to beyond messaging, what specifically can or do you see Whitmer as being able to do, especially when considering, just earlier this week, she was able to go to the White House and lobby for much needed storm recovery funds, perhaps because she has a less adversarial relationship with the president?
Yeah, I think that it's great. I think we have to, at any time we can, come together to work for the working class. But what I will say is, I think true power, a lot of times in some of these situations when you're facing people like Donald Trump, comes from public pressure and comes from the people. So I believe the governor should be encouraging the people of this state to be publicly pushing back. And to stay silent on that issue, to me, is something that's unacceptable.
Representative Wegela, you've got your rose lapel pin here on your lapel. You're one of the most outspoken progressives in the state legislature. Over the past few months, we've had 2 ballot proposals of policies that are held sort of in high esteem by progressives when taxing the rich and then instituting ranked choice voting. Both failed to continue their ballot question campaigns to get on the ballots in 2026. Is this a reflection of, you think, where momentum is behind major progressive policies?
You know, I think we are facing this time where wealth is incredibly concentrated. 3 people have more wealth in the bottom half of this country. And I think it is great that we are trying to pass these ballot initiatives. And so one of the things I always try to do is push more people to get involved. The rose lapel pin, by the way, I'm a democratic socialist. I don't consider myself a progressive. And I try to drive people to places where they can organize, because the truth is nothing's going to change unless the working class en masse gets organized. So it is unfortunate the ballot initiatives have failed, but I think we have to keep coming back to the table. And I'm holding out my hope that Mop-Up Michigan will pass so that we can get corporate money out of politics, and hopefully they'll get the signatures I need.
So on that, in that vein, you know, we talked about utility rates a little bit, and one of the issues that you've sort of jumped on recently that other folks in the legislature have gotten involved with, and this is actually one of the areas that, you know, there is some cross the aisle agreement is data centers, and we're seeing, you know, a lot of folks talking about it, a lot of folks starting to grapple with the idea of, you know, one of these developments coming to their community. Can you tell us a little bit about what this is looking like?
Yeah, so it's one of the things we've been working on in the Corporate Subsidies and State Investments Subcommittee. And what we saw several years ago under the Democratic majority was passing use and sales tax exemptions for data centers, which I voted no on the time. So I've worked with my colleagues Aaron Burns and Jim DeSena to introduce legislation to repeal that. I've also worked with Rep. Wartz and Fox to introduce a moratorium bill. And the reason that I have introduced those pieces of legislation is because we're seeing dozens of projects pop up across the state, which I think threaten not only energy costs and water utility costs going up. You know, if you look at the Saline Township project, I believe that's estimated to power 1 million homes or increase DTE's energy load by 25%. But we also need to address that data centers are what's powering AI right now. And to me, it makes no sense for the state to be encouraging the AI technology that might lead to, one, it's largely unregulated, but it might lead to the replacement of just thousands of working class jobs, as well as many other environmental issues. There's so many things that we should be cautious about with data centers, and it feels like, to me, the door's being just opened for them rather than, hey, let's take our time to figure out, are there ways and guardrails we need to put around this?
And here again, the governor's on one side, you're on the other, and her argument is JOBS.
Yeah, well, if you look actually at data centers, they don't create a lot of long-term jobs. They do create some good jobs in construction, but I think it's short-sighted, because how many jobs are going to be replaced by artificial intelligence over time? You know, my first job that I had was at Taco Bell. If you go to Taco Bell now and you go through the drive-thru, your order is largely taken by artificial intelligence.
So is the governor out of step on this one, too?
I think so. I think if you listen to the people of Michigan and you look at what's happening across the state, you have coalitions at the grassroots level forming from the right and the left coming together to block data centers.
Did you vote for her?
I did.
You regret it?
No, because the alternative choice would have been something much worse.
So oh, you first, please.
These questions bring up an interesting point, because you found areas of crossover with people who you might consider on the right flank of the Republican Party, where you guys have aligned yourselves on, for lack of a better term, sort of economic populist policies. But then there's a broad swath of lawmakers in the middle, people who might be considered, say, more business-friendly, both in the Republican and Democratic Party, who you disagree with on a number of key issues here. Why is that?
You know, I'm willing to work with anyone in the legislature to advance policies that help the working class. I do think it's important that when people in power are doing things that are harmful to the working class, we call that out, such as I mentioned earlier with Donald Trump. But I think we're in this weird place in politics, right, where I think some of the things are a little unclear, right? I don't think the left-right alignment on the issue of data centers has been established yet. It's something new, but I really do believe in something on some area issues. It's really more of an elite or working class issue. Data centers is one of those. I think the idea that we're going to concentrate wealth and power to the hands of a few concerns not only me, but some of my colleagues on the right.
When Mike Duggan said the trifecta effect it did nothing when you had power. What did you think?
I think that that's just not true. I mean, we repealed right to work. We restored prevailing wage.
So where is he coming on that?
I think that Mike Duggan is trying to find himself a lane for the governorship. But I think the truth is there's probably no one running for governor who's going to be more pro-corporate than Mike Duggan.
Do you have any concerns, though, that he could draw away votes from whomever the Democratic nominee ends up being?
Sure, and I think it is on the Democratic nominee, whoever that ends up being, to make the case that we need to present the future for working class people that they want, and we need to back that up with what we're actually doing.
To that end, in the last presidential election, we saw deep divisions among Democrats, leftists, progressives, et cetera, a coalition divided, so to speak. How do you see that being repaired, especially heading into the 2026 midterms?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that we're putting forward platforms that people actually want. And I think one of those, we need candidates that are running that aren't taking corporate PAC money. We also need to be making the argument, in my opinion, that we have universal health care, or at least at the bare minimum, finding ways to hold the insurance companies accountable for what they're doing to us, which is raising rates on us. And I believe basically what I'm trying to say is that there needs to be a populist message from the Democratic candidates that is popular, but also that is backed up by their actions. Because so many times we have people run for office, they get in office, and then they start doing other things.
Are you seeing that now?
I think I think so. I mean, we hear candidates all across, all over the place talk about how they want to rein in energy costs, and then when they get to office, what happens? DT is, essentially blocking anything from happening because they donate more to politics than anybody.
Very quickly, does your party spend too much time talking about social issues?
I don't think so. I think it's important that we stand up for
the governor says tabletop issues.
What I would say is, I think in order to have a working class that is together to fight against the elite class, we have to fight for each other and have solidarity with
What are
each
you
other.
running for next, Representative?
That's a good question. I guess we'll see soon.
Give me a guess.
I think maybe the state senate eventually.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you. Also, thanks to our panel. Thank you for watching Off the Record. See more of that right here next week.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan public television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.